No,
But
all
we're
of
all
ours are in
protected.
helping.
Sorry?
All of ours are in helping professions, and so my wife is the last.
Yeah, my daughter's an anthropologist. She's actually teaching at the NYU Engineering School, but she decided not to ask for a vaccine because I think she's teaching remotely, and I think she felt like other people should get shots first. And my son-in-law,
She's right.
Yeah, my son-in-law works for a tech company and he works at home, so he's not eligible at all.
Want to say welcome to everybody who's coming in. Thank you for coming. We're going to give everybody else a few more minutes to come. So enjoy the chat, enjoy the small talk while you're waiting. Also, if you can throw into the chat where you're from, we always like to see where people are signing in from. So I will get that going. Make sure to do it to all panelists and attendees so everyone can see it. And I got us started. So if anybody wants to put up there where they're from. I don't mean to cut you off. I'm just going to keep welcoming people.
Okay.
So
I'm just watching to see what people say.
Yeah.
Okay, one of those people is an old childhood friend of mine.
Well, one of them is my father.
Works.
So. Oh, Vermont. Okay. Yeah,
New York City.
Yep.
What the amazing thing is that we're all together in the same place, even as we're all alone in our own homes. It's an amazing thing that we can do this. I'll be glad when we don't have to do it quite so often, but it's really amazing.
No, but it's nice.
It is truly, I think, a phenomenal technology that, I mean, I can't imagine how we would have gotten through this at all without this kind of technology. It's just, all right, a college friend.
So see, it gets fun a little bit, everybody. Right, make sure to do it to all panelists and attendees so everybody can see the.
All right, I just meant to do that.
They did what in 1918? Oh, they got through they got through the pandemic in 1918, I think was the point.
Sure, they did, but I think it was very different, right?
People didn't get on a piece of a machine and end up at the other side of the world 4 hours later.
Sorry,
so things spread differently now.
Right. And one of the things I realized, my mother was born in January of 1918. Oh my gosh, excuse me. I'm going to get my phone out of here. Michael.
Okay, it's good we didn't open yet. That worked well. I mean, we opened, but didn't go live yet.
Okay. Sorry, I thought I
So, Drora, how's the weather in Israel?
Yeah, I had my phone not ring, but that didn't work.
No,
it's
New York City is sunny and beautiful. Spring has come.
Well, today it was 91 in Beit Shemesh. I don't know what it was here, but it was here. He's still on this. They went through it without the phones too.
It's in
the pandemic in 1918.
Right, I know, but I was thinking about the fact that literally my mother was born at the very beginning of the pandemic. And the interesting thing is, I don't think anybody in my family ever talked about that, ever, right? Never.
No.
I've never heard anybody say, oh, and when your mother was a baby, there was a massive flu pandemic.
Interesting.
Really interesting.
And your grandparents must have gone through it. I mean,
well, of course. And my mother was the youngest of 5 children by a lot. I mean, her older sisters and her brother were, 10, 15, 20 years older than she was. And nobody ever said anything about it. It was like it never happened.
Yeah, things change. Now everybody talks about everything. You know what somebody had for lunch today, right?
Well, yeah, there's that.
True, it's true. So we can do it.
Okay. I think we have a critical mass at this point. So if everybody's ready, I'm going to welcome everyone. Oh, wait, there's one more comment. Oh, my father was 20 and he never talked about it.
Right, I see this. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so first of all, thank you everyone for coming, and those who haven't thrown into the chat where you're from, throw into the chat where you're from, make sure to do it to all panelists and attendees. It's always nice. Little bit of logistics. You'll see that you can't open your cameras and microphones now. Professor Fine and I will also go black in a few minutes. But by the end, first, Professor Kraemer will be giving her talk, and then we will open the microphones and cameras and allow for questions. However, if there's a burning question that you have to get across, please throw it into the chat or Q&A. I will be monitoring it, and I'll decide whether it really needs to be right then, or I'll ask it at the end. So I'm very happy to ask all the questions at the end as well, as long as Professor Kraemer has time for us. So today we're very honored because not only do we have a wonderful speaker who I've seen the slides, so at least that much I know, but I've also seen some of her talks before. I'm excited to have her, but we have the Horgan Professor of Jewish Studies, Jewish History, I keep wanting to say studies, sorry, of Jewish History at Yeshiva University. Professor Stephen Fine is going to be introducing our speaker today. So thank you all for coming, and thank you both professors.
Hi, everybody. I can't tell you how honored I am to be here with you today, Dora, and everyone who's out there. Ross Kraemer has written a truly phenomenal and important book called The Mediterranean Diaspora in Late Antiquity, What Christianity Cost the Jews, which is a great title. Ross Kraemer is Professor Emerita of Religious Studies and Judaic Studies at Brown University, where she specialized in early Christianity and other religions of the Greco-Roman Mediterranean, including, by and by, Judaism. She holds an MA and a Ph.D. from Princeton, a BA from Smith, and her many publications have focused particularly on gender and women's religions in the Greco-Roman Mediterranean and on aspects of Jews and Judaism in the late antique Mediterranean diaspora. Now, the last line, and aspects of Jews and Judaism in the late antique Mediterranean diaspora, is a bit modest because, in fact, her newest book transforms how people will think about all of those distant Greek-speaking communities spread across the Mediterranean world through her sophisticated reading of text and inscriptions. So with that, Ross, you're on.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Steve. That was a lovely introduction. I hope you're right, but we'll see. I'm going to do this 1 second. Here's the book. There you go, book. So I want to start by telling you all a little about what I thought I was doing with this book. I'm going to show you some pretty pictures, and then I look forward to your questions. So the central question that I wanted to answer when I started to work on this book seemed to me at the time to be pretty straightforward. I wanted to know what happened to Jews of the Mediterranean diaspora in late antiquity. And by late antiquity here, I mean roughly the 4th to the 6th centuries of the Common Era. This phrasing carries several implications. First, that something happened to Jews in the Mediterranean diaspora. And second of all, that whatever this was didn't happen to Jews elsewhere, whether in the land of Israel or in the Babylonian diaspora or anyplace else. But those are pretty much the options. So the first part of this seemed to me to be sufficiently self-evident. At the time of the Emperor Constantine, the majority, and that's the beginning of the 4th century, the majority of Jewish inhabitants of the Roman Empire appear to have lived outside the land of Israel, or its sort of proximate environments, to have spoken Greek and sometimes, but probably a lot less frequently, Latin as their first, if not their only language, to have read scripture and to have venerated God in those languages. But ultimately, almost none of this would be true. While a tiny minority of Jews appear to have continued to speak Greek, both in their ordinary lives and in liturgical settings, the vast majority of Jews ceased to speak, read scripture, or worship in Greek, perhaps as early as a few centuries after Constantine. Now, questions of Jewish habitation, that is, where did Jews live, are extremely complicated. But it's also unquestionable that in many regions where large populations of Jews once lived, far fewer ultimately do. And the vast majority of Jews eventually come to reside elsewhere, especially, but of course not only, in Eastern Europe. Yet the chronology of these changes, that is, when does all this happen, and the processes by which they were effected have long eluded us, in part due to the nature of the sources that we have. Non-Jewish writers, both Christian and non-Christian, write occasionally about Jews in the late antique Mediterranean diaspora, and a relatively small number of late Roman laws pertain to Jews. But, and this is kind of the hard part, but from Jews themselves, we have no identifiable literary accounts in either Greek or Latin dating between the 4th and the 7th centuries. We have only material evidence, including primarily inscriptions and the remains of some ancient synagogues, including a dozen or so actual sites. And here I'm going to attempt, with the sort of wonders of modern technology, to show you some of this. Let's see if this works. Okay, hopefully this will work. So the first thing, what you're seeing now here is just sort of a, not a wonderful image, but it's useful enough of the scope of the ancient Mediterranean. This is from an Atlas of the Jewish World prepared by Nicolas Delange. And you can sort of see there the outlines of the, sort of in the pink border of the Roman world. On the right-hand side of it is sort of ancient Persian, Neo-Babylonian. For my purposes, you can just pretend that's not there. But it's the stuff in the sort of to the left of that and all around the Mediterranean that we're interested in. And here, in part, is Delange's attempt to delineate the areas for which we have evidence of where Jews lived. And so that's just sort of useful to process. Now, the next thing I want to show you here, let's see how this works. Is this going to work? Yes. Okay. Next thing I want to show you here, this is the kind of evidence that we have for Jews in this period. And here you see two very nice examples of inscriptions from Roman catacombs of what we think are Jewish burials. On the left-hand side, I think we're fairly certain this is a Jewish burial. This says, some of you may be able to read this even though it is in fact in Greek. It just says Aster, which might be the word that it is in Greek. Aster is the word that means star, and it might have been a name. It's also remotely possible that this is Astor for Esther, but that isn't what it says. And it has on it a very characteristic 7-branched menorah, which is a representation of the lampstand in the temple. And then it's got a number of other interesting things on it. Underneath the menorah on the right might be an etrog. It gets a little difficult to tell what some of these things are. This might be a lulav, it might be a shofar, it might not, and there are some birds. The inscription on the right, which is a lot fuller, but I hate to tell you this, I'm having trouble seeing it because it's being blocked partly by my little Zoom windows, but this is a burial inscription for a man who bore the title of Gerusiarch, which is thought to mean the head of a council of elders from a synagogue. And this is also a Greek inscription, even though these inscriptions are coming from Rome. Most of the Jewish inscriptions from Rome are in fact in Greek, not Latin, although a few of them are in Latin. And there are lots more of these, but I, in the interest of time, I'm not going to show you tons and tons of them. But we have from Rome something like 500 of these inscriptions, give or take a few. And that's the largest single clump of these kinds of inscriptions that we have. Now, let's see how this works. Good. Here, just for sort of to show you some other very pretty objects. These also come from Jewish catacombs. These are the bottoms of goblets, gold goblets, that are sort of broken off and stuck into the walls of the catacomb. And they're really very beautiful, and they have representations, again, of the 7-branched menorah. They have, as you can see here, on the right-hand side, they seem again to have representations of a shofar and an etrog. And they have lions, as you can see, and then in the one on the left and also on the right seems to be a representation of an open cabinet that holds scrolls. And it's interesting to see here that the scrolls are not one single large scroll, as we might think of a modern Torah scroll, but rather here individual rolls of books that are seen at the very end. So you're seeing the scroll rolled up and then put in sort of horizontally into a box. Some of these, as the one on the right, say on them, have a Greek inscription, and the one on the right actually says "Pie zeses," which means basically drink up and live, which is a rather interesting thing. But we have a number of these, and then, you know, we have a bunch of other interesting things, but I thought you might enjoy seeing these. Now, and this is also, this last sort of is another representation. This is actually a wall painting from another Jewish catacomb in Rome. And again, it has some similar images. You can see here what looks like a sort of representation of a temple, looking very much kind of like a Greek temple, and a menorah, and again, what might be an etrog, and a number of other interesting things. So these wall paintings are very common in some ancient Jewish catacombs, but these are also probably the catacombs of fairly wealthy people who can afford both to buy these spaces and then to pay for people to put up these beautiful decorations. The next thing I want to show you here are some synagogues. And the interesting thing is we have roughly a dozen sites or so that have been identified as where there actually were synagogue buildings. In addition to this, we have a number of pieces of what appear to have been sort of elements of synagogues that have been found not in the site in which they are likely to have originally occurred. But what I'm showing you now are the sites of actual synagogues, or what's left of them. And what's interesting about this a little bit is, I'll talk about this a little bit more, but what happens to these synagogues and how late they exist. And you'll see on the top of the slides, I've just indicated a little bit about sort of what we know roughly about the dates of these synagogues here. And this will be important in a minute, so you can just kind of see. This is a synagogue from the island of Aegina, off the coast of Greece. And some of you may even perhaps have gone to see these. And this is kind of a typical problem. This synagogue was originally thought to be somewhat earlier, and like a lot of these synagogues, it's now been redated somewhat later. This one may have been destroyed in the 5th century. This is a much more recently found building on the coast of Turkey, in a place called Andriake. And it too, it appears to have been in use in the 5th century, but appears not to have been in use in the 6th century, and it's not entirely clear what happened to it. This is also another view of Andriake, and this is actually a very nice picture of a Menorah Relief, which was found at this site. And this is, and unfortunately, I can't, somebody tell me what the top of the, Steve, can you tell me what the top of this says?
This is a pamia.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so this is actually from Syria, and this is a donor inscription in Greek. It's a rather nice mosaic inscription. So I guess technically that's not an inscription, but we'll call it an inscription anyway. And here I'll show you the translation of it. It says, in the time of the most honored archisynagogoi, the heads of the synagogues, Eusebius and Nehemias, maybe that's Nehemiah, and Phineas, and of Theodorus, the Gerusiarch, that is the head of the council of elders, and the most honored elders, Isakios, Isaac, and Saulos, Saul, and the rest. Elasios, the archisynagogos, the head, we think, of the synagogue of the Antiochenes, paid for, literally the Greek is made, right, paid for 150 feet of the entryway of the mosaic in the year that translates to 392 of the Common Era. And this is not a typical donor plaque from ancient synagogues. So, you know, those things that you may be well familiar with in your own lives, whether from a synagogue or a public building, that thanks the people who paid for it. People in antiquity put these things up as well. And it's nice that they did, because it gives us a little bit of information about their communities. This should be a floor mosaic from a synagogue in Italy at a site called Bova Marina from the 5th century, and maybe even perhaps the 6th century. I think, if I remember this correctly, the site of Bova Marina, the whole area was destroyed at the end of the 6th century. So this may still have been in use during the 6th century, but the whole area is essentially uninhabited after that. This is a relatively new site that was found on a small Aegean island that is really essentially right off the coast of Turkey, but is sort of nominally part of Greece. This was uncovered only a few years ago, and we still don't know very much about it, except that it appears to have been a synagogue. And I'll show you a detail of that here. This is actually sort of a vase, and here's some of the mosaic. There is an inscription, but as far as I know, it hasn't been published yet, so I can't really tell you what it says. Now, this is a very different, interesting example. This comes from a site in Spain called Elche, for which there's been a great deal of dispute. This site is actually in private hands. It's very unusual, but it's owned by a family that owns the land. It was eventually a church. This is quite clear that it is subsequently a church. There's been a lot of dispute, though, about whether or not it was originally a synagogue, and it has a couple of major inscriptions that certainly would be consistent with it being a synagogue. This photograph that you see here was taken by one of my graduate students at Brown, who now teaches at the University of Miami, and who went to Elche to see if she could figure out a little bit more about whether or not this really was a synagogue. Now, if you look on the right-hand side, you look closely, you will see images that kind of look like they might be representations of a seven-branched menorah. But unfortunately, the middle of it is destroyed, and it's really hard to tell. I'll show you one more photograph. This is a close-up of this. And Robin has argued that probably this is the representation of a menorah, but when you see it as part of the whole larger floor, it's a little odd, because it would sort of be as though somebody put a little menorah in the corner of a big mosaic floor. But there it is. And many people do think, in fact, that this was a synagogue. So we'll just keep it that way with a question mark. Now, this is an older photograph of a synagogue in Jordan, in Gerasa, that I just wanted to show you a little bit of this. This synagogue is a particularly interesting case, because we know that it was converted to a church in the year 530, 531. There is a dedicatory inscription at the site that makes this very clear. This is one of my favorites. This comes from a synagogue in North Africa, in a town called Hamanlif. This is modern Tunisia. You will notice this is not a picture of the actual mosaic. This is a drawing. The actual mosaic was cut up into a number of pieces, and it no longer exists in this form. So this is taken from an old drawing that was made of it, but that is quite lovely. A few pieces of it, for those of you who might be in New York, are in the Brooklyn Museum, which had a lovely exhibition about this a number of years ago. And the central inscription in the middle of this, which is in Latin, is the donor inscription, probably at least for the whole floor, if not for the entire building. And it was made by a woman whose name was either Julia or Juliana. It was one or the other, but it's quite an interesting thing to see. And she appears to be sort of the only donor responsible for what you're looking at. And here's a detail from that mosaic. This is another relatively recently found synagogue. This is one of the interesting things about these synagogues. They keep cropping up in all sorts of places. This one is also from Tunisia, and it's actually not that far from the Hamanlif site that I showed you before. And this is a rather unusual mosaic with a whole bunch of these representations of the menorah sort of in an almost circular pattern. This is a very famous synagogue. Some of you may have heard of this. Some of you, if you've gone to Italy, may even have seen this. This is a large synagogue site outside of the city of Rome in an area called Ostia, or actually Ostia Antica, that was discovered in the 1960s. And it has recently been re-excavated by a team from the University of Texas, which has now argued that the synagogue is much later than was originally thought, that it was both built later and fell apart or was destroyed later, and that it can be dated at least to the late 5th and maybe even the early 6th century. And I'll show you a couple more shots of this. This is This is an apse, which may or may not have been where Torah scrolls would have been kept, but at the very least, it's an apse. On the other hand, lots of ancient buildings in this period also have this kind of round apse feature. And there you can see it again. And then this is the underside of a column from the site, but this is actually off-site at a little museum. And you can see again the representation of the menorah, and with what clearly looks to be a shofar on the right and an etrog and a lulav on the left. This photograph is another really famous site, but probably one that people are less likely to have seen. This one is in Turkey from a site called Sardis. This is the largest known synagogue from the diaspora. It's a very large site, relatively speaking. And those people in this photograph are actually a colleague of mine and a team of graduate students and their spouses that we took to Turkey 21 years ago in 2000. So this is actually my own, a number of these are my own photographs, and this is one of them. And actually someplace in this photograph is my anthropologist daughter, who had then just graduated from college, but I can't see which one she is. More importantly, for your purposes, if you look, you will be able to see pieces of the mosaic floor. And at the very end of this synagogue is a large semicircular marble seating area with a number of benches. And in front of it is a very large table held up by figures of eagles that might have been a site for reading scrolls of some sort, but it's very large and it's kind of tall. And so if it was used in that way, it probably needed some additional pieces of furniture to make that possible. It's not sort of your basic table height structure. Sardis is really interesting. Here's a couple of more shots. Here's the eagle table. This is a shot looking east. At the eastern end of this, as you will see, there are two sort of small niches that, again, some scholars think might have been places where you could display Torah scrolls or some other kind of scrolls. And on the sides, on those walls, are some beautiful mosaic panels with inscriptions running along the top. The Sardis Synagogue also now has been redated, although there's some disagreement about this, but it's possible that the Sardis Synagogue was still standing at the very beginning of the 7th century, at which point pretty much the whole city gets destroyed, both by an earthquake and perhaps also by some military actions. And it's just unclear just how late this site was still functioning as a synagogue. And then this is just one more piece of the mosaic at Sardis. And then this, and I think this is my last example, this is a synagogue from Greece at a site called Stobi that was replaced by a church in the 5th century. So this is a lot of the kinds of evidence that we have for trying to make sense of what happens to Jews in late antiquity from a kind of Jewish point of view. Now, dating this evidence with precision is notoriously difficult, but it's pretty clear that by the 5th century, this evidence is considerably diminished. By the 6th century, identifiably Jewish inscriptions in Greek or Latin are even rarer, particularly in places like Asia Minor, that is modern Turkey, where once they were relatively plentiful. Most of the sites that I just showed you, these diaspora synagogue sites, appear to have ceased functioning as synagogues by the 5th century. None of them are known to have been intact and functioning. I want to stress both of those things. Later than the 6th century, although as I just suggested to you, one or two might still have been standing in the early 7th century and not yet actively destroyed. Yet the absence of evidence is not inherently evidence of absence, as the title of the introductory chapter of the book signals. Conceivably, Jews continued to live in these regions, and we just now can't see them for various reasons, including the arbitrariness of archaeological finds and the increasing reluctance of Jews to identify themselves as such under difficult social and historical conditions, right? So as I pointed out to you and I showed you those slides, a number of synagogues have been discovered in recent years, but not because anybody was looking for them. They get discovered because archaeologists are excavating some town, someplace, and they come across something that sort of says to them, oh, wait, there's a menorah on this mosaic floor. I think I just found a synagogue. But they didn't go looking for it. So a lot of this is arbitrary, and my sneaking suspicion here is that if we were to be able to do a kind of concerted effort to find these sites, we would probably find lots more. Virtually no other scholars have comprehensively tackled the question of what happened to these Jews and why. In the book, I argue that this is partly because the history of diaspora Jews poses challenges to both Christian and Jewish master narratives that few scholars have wished to confront. In dominant Jewish narratives, the demise of the Second Temple was followed quickly by the supremacy of Rabbinic Judaism, not only in the land of Israel, but throughout the ancient world, leaving no space for a flourishing but non-rabbinic diaspora. And this turns out to be particularly apparent in many overviews of Jewish history, at least from the 19th century on. And if you want to look at this yourself, you can just get a bunch of sort of survey histories of Jews and look at the table of contents. I actually did this for quite some time. Replicating modern Jewish debates about the dangers of assimilation, some Jewish accounts simply presume that the majority of diaspora Jews eventually became Christians, perhaps voluntarily, a transformation facilitated by their prior assimilation into the larger Mediterranean culture, especially their fluency in Greek and the social relations with non-Jews that such fluency is presumed to have facilitated. Some Jewish scholarship may also eschew the study of the late antique Mediterranean diaspora because this history has also recently become implicated in debates about modern Jewish claims to the land of Israel. And the thinking goes something like this: if Mediterranean Jewish populations left Israel voluntarily and/or came to find their residence outside the land of Israel as acceptable, this could be, and in fact has been, construed as evidence that Jews relinquished their claims to their homeland and cannot now renege. The issues of Christian scholars are somewhat different, but the result turns out to be the same. In traditional Christian narratives, the persistence of flourishing Jewish populations after the first century of the Common Era undercuts Christian claims to fulfill Jewish scriptures and supplant Jewish religion. And although I didn't raise this in the book, some modern Christian scholars have shown considerably more interest in demonstrating that Judaism flourished in the ancient Mediterranean for centuries after the beginnings of Christianity, and much less interest in interrogating the pernicious impact on Jews of the Christianization of the empire. The arguments that I ultimately make in this book are not entirely what I initially anticipated. Years of prior work with Jewish inscriptions that I've just showed you a handful of grounded my expectation that the evidence for Jews dropped off precipitously, probably corresponding in some indeterminate way to actual demographic decline. But I also thought that explanations for that decline in evidence would be difficult to verify. I ended up arguing that, at least in some places, the increasing absence of evidence for Jews is evidence for the decline of local Jewish populations, and that there are good, plausible explanations for such decline. Now, often this was for the same reasons that other populations declined in these same centuries and regions: earthquakes, devastating ecological disasters and epidemics of plague, and frequent warfare. Factors that I became more aware of as my research progressed, and sort of conveniently, as the state of scholarship has improved, especially on the first three of these: earthquakes, ecological disasters, and plague. But from the 4th to the very early 7th centuries, which is the point at which I chose for lots of reasons to stop, Jews were also subject to extensive pressure from a Christianizing empire. Christian bishops preached sermons aimed at firing up their Christian parishioners against local Jews. And I think here I just will show you a couple of, these are not actual pictures of these people, but these are, now come on, you can do it. Yes, you can do it. Okay, so these are just, these are sort of older mosaic representations. On the left, this is Ambrose of Milan, and on the right, this is a statue of the Emperor Theodosius I, who was the emperor at sort of the end of the 4th century. And Ambrose was a virulent supporter of his understanding of Orthodox Christianity and therefore an opponent of everybody who wasn't, including Jews. And there's a particularly famous confrontation between Ambrose of Milan and Theodosius over Theodosius's response to the destruction of a synagogue in a little town called Callinicum, which is actually Raqqa, sort of on the Euphrates, on the sort of border of the Roman Empire in the, I think it's in 388. So Ambrose had lots of rather unpleasant things to say about Jews and was very angry at Theodosius when Theodosius was not happy about the destruction of this synagogue and attempted to punish the perpetrators. And then I think I have one more for you here. Yeah, these are two other Christian writers. Gregory of Tours and Gregory the Great actually probably don't rank in the list of the sort of worst offenders here of people who riled up their supporters against Jews, but they are also the sources for some interesting accounts of Jews in late antiquity. And Gregory the Great in particular was a proponent of the view that I'll talk about again a little bit later, that it's better to persuade Jews to convert than it is to force them to convert. Oh, so I just thought I'd show you a little sort of visual break there. So various Christian sources recount stories of mobs of Christian men who attacked synagogues and sometimes Jews themselves, often under the direction of bishops, or at least with the bishop's tacit support. And that little story that I just told you about Ambrose and Theodosius I, that account of the destruction of the synagogue of Callinicum is exactly one of those episodes. Now, some of these accounts are more plausible than others. But the reality of such violence is strengthened by the numerous laws which criminalize such attacks, even when, as scholars have noted, the prescribed penalties are relatively toothless. It's difficult to say how widespread or how frequent such attacks were, although it's important to keep in mind that occasional violence or even just the threat of violence can be deeply damaging to the persons and groups who are its target. Other laws pertaining to Jews, preserved primarily in the codes of Theodosian and Justinian, illuminate the additional pressures on Jews. Legal disincentives to remaining Jews, including inheritance penalties, burdensome public offices, restrictions on occupations, limitations on slaveholding and slave trading, and others. Corresponding incentives to convert included reduced taxes, cash payments, prestigious public appointments, and more. I didn't fully anticipate what became a central thesis of the book, that Jews were neither the first, nor the only, nor the greatest targets of these pressures. On the contrary, the pressures on Jews were part of a larger project to transform the entire Roman Empire, if not the entire known world, into a homogeneous Orthodox Catholic polity. The many implementers of this project, Christian bishops and their associates, compliant emperors and their administrations, first concerned themselves primarily with the suppression of intra-Christian difference and the eradication of various traditional Mediterranean religions, and only then with the containment and/or the conversion of Jews and their cultural cousins, the Samaritans. Further and significantly, the laws of Christian emperors, often at the behests of Christian lobbyists, aimed at the total eradication of dissidents and traditionalists, but never at the total elimination of Jews, or as far as I can tell, Samaritans, but that's a little more complicated. Jews retained the legal rights, remedies, and protections they had held earlier in the empire, while traditional practitioners and their cult sites had none, nor did many dissenting Christians. The reasons for this are not entirely clear, but I speculate on several. Jews had a unique place in the Christian cosmology. Having initially received and transmitted the scriptures on whose prophecy of Christ Christians relied, Jews were essential guarantors of the truth. At the same time, the conversion of the Jews was essential to Christian scenarios of the end, Christian eschatological scenarios, particularly as laid out in Paul's famous letter to the Romans, chapters 9 to 11. The total elimination of Jews before the end would falsify Paul's prediction and remove Jews as the unwitting guarantors of the truth of the divine scriptures that prophesied Christ. These policies appear then theologically coherent. They allowed for the harassment of Jews and pressures to convert them, But they also prohibited the total eradication of Jews. And at least for some of those people in power, the complete conversion of the Jews presaged the imminent end of the world in a manner that many might not yet have wished to see fulfilled. Now, I do want to note that, and some of you may be aware of this, that this will change with the Spanish Visigothic Councils of the 7th century, but these are pretty much, they are beyond the scope of my project. But to give you just one example, a canon of the 15th Council of Toledo in 681 is a concise but rather chilling and comprehensive collation of the prohibitions on Jewish practices that are never found in late imperial Roman legislation. So here's what's in the book for those of you who have not read it. The book begins with an introductory chapter with the usual components, including a defense of my choice to write about Jews in the Mediterranean diaspora rather than a book about all the Jews. There's then a lengthy chapter on the so-called Letter of Severus of Minorca on the conversion of the Jews, which details how in the space of 1 week in February of 418, the entire population of Jewish inhabitants on the island of Minorca agreed to become Christians. Once a mob of Christians from the western town of Yemona descended on the eastern town of Magona and burnt the synagogue down to its foundations. The letter avoids saying explicitly that the Christians burnt the synagogue, but that's what they did. It may or may not be the work of an actual bishop named Severus, and some aspects of its account may reflect actual events on Minorca, but as I argue at some length, it's extremely difficult to tell. But nevertheless, the text encapsulates the issues with which my book wrestles, and I come back to it repeatedly. There are then 7 more chapters which detail the pressures that are put on Jews in the diaspora, beginning with the reign of Constantine and ending more or less with the death of Gregory the Great, often known as Pope Gregory, at the turn of the 7th century. Most of these are organized around the surviving late antique legislation pertaining to Jews preserved both in the Codex Theodosianus and the Codex Justinianus, and endeavor to place that legislation within whatever we can know of the larger historical contexts for those centuries. And the final chapter actually talks about Jews and considers how Jews in the diaspora themselves may have responded to these pressures. And here's what I say about that. Undoubtedly, these pressures sometimes resulted in conversion, although the direct evidence is quite meager, but I do want to show you one piece of the direct evidence. And this will just take me back here again. And that's a little map of Minorca. But this is the piece I want to show you. This is an inscription. It comes from Grado in northern Italy that basically says here, it's also the illustration on the cover of the book, and it says, "Here rests Petrus, or Peter, also called Pepario, son of Olympius, a Jew, and the only one of his gens," I actually deliberately didn't translate the word gens here, "who deserved to attain the grace of Christ. And in this holy space, he was buried with dignity on July 14th in the 4th year of the indiction." This is very unusual to have an inscription that actually identifies someone as a converted Jew. And the line here that Petrus Pepario was the only one of his gens. It's not entirely clear what gens means here. It might mean his people, but it might just mean his family, who deserved to attain the grace of Christ. This is a really rather unusual statement to make, but there it is. And what we do with it is complicated, but I thought you might like to see it. So the totality of this evidence, primarily literary and legal, but occasionally epigraphic, suggests that some Jews became Christians under serious duress, including actual or threatened violence. Some people probably chose to become Christians with little or no sense of compulsion, and many, I think, did so under circumstances that we just can't ever get at. Other Jews appear to have emigrated, perhaps to safer havens, including parts of the disintegrating Roman Empire where friendlier governments held power, like that of the Arian Theodoric based in Ravenna. Some evidence suggests that Jews were not just the victims of Christian violence, but players themselves, although the evidence for these contestations inevitably comes from sources that we need to read with seasoned skepticism. Other sources hint that Jews leveraged networks of political and social relations to lobby for their own interests, although these networks are largely obscured. On several occasions, Jews may have entertained the possibility of divine intervention. One such account, set on Crete in the mid-5th century, ends with the entirely voluntary conversion of Jews to Christianity after they recognize that they have been almost lured to their deaths by a false prophet claiming to be Moses. and friendly Christian fishermen come to their rescue. This is an account in a Christian writer. Another involves a massive gathering of diaspora Jews on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem on Sukkot, also in the mid-5th century, and ends with their slaughter by hostile heavenly forces, or rampaging Christian monks, depending on which of the competing agents you think is more plausible. I can tell you what my vote is. Far better attested are at least 2 actual Samaritan revolts against Rome in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, but these are Samaritan revolts, and the evidence for comparable Jewish revolts is extremely thin. I also argue that although the evidence is thin, the increasing use of Hebrew in later Jewish epitaphs in some regions, especially southern Italy, might suggest that some Jews embraced forms of Jewish practice that constructed tighter social boundaries, including perhaps some interest in the offerings of rabbis traveling occasionally to the Western diaspora. I consider the possibility that the prevalence of inscriptions for Jewish women with titles of synagogue office in the 4th and 5th century may somehow reflect the stresses on Jewish communities in these years, analogous to other evidence that in times of social stress, women take on communal responsibilities from which they are ordinarily restricted. And last, I argue that like everyone else in the region, some significant number of Jews died, particularly in the mid-6th century, not only from widespread war, but from a particularly perfect storm of a worldwide ecological crisis that many of you have probably never heard of, caused by 2 massive volcanic eruptions and recurring and probably related waves of plague epidemic that devastated the region. Although Jews appear no more likely than Christians to have died from the famines that were caused by these volcanic eruptions or the subsequent waves of plague, the demographic impact may have been disproportionate. Many relatively small Jewish populations in any given location may have found it impossible to recover from the death of upwards of 40% of their numbers. I wish I had been able to consider this a little bit more than I did, but part of the problem is we have no actual demographic evidence on which to draw and must rely entirely on analogies from comparable events. And of course, I wrote this before the beginning of a devastating worldwide pandemic that we are all living through that makes us better attuned to the havoc that this can wreak. So I'm going to stop here now. I was going to tell you a little bit more sort of about the challenges of writing this book for me. But I think that I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions. So I think I'm going to stop here. I know that Steve Fine has at least one question, and then we'll see sort of where the rest of the discussion goes.
That was wonderful.
Yes, I want to say thank you first before we go on, so you'll allow me to interrupt. And I think this was just a great way to end this session of our New Works Wednesdays of the Institute of Jewish Experience. So thank you so much for kind of giving it a different historical perspective. So I really appreciate that. So you all know, I will be allowing you to open your cameras and microphones as Professor Fine asks his questions. So.
I'll tell you, Ross, why I found your book so compelling. And that is that you are explicit in writing that this book isn't just about the ancient world, but that your experience and our experience in the contemporary world inform your question and the way that you present the question, and even have come to think about the question differently than you might have in a different decade. And I wonder if you'd like to share with us why this book matters to people who don't care about people who've been dead for 1,500 years.
Right, exactly, right, even though I do. Right.
I do too.
But, yes, right. And I can answer this. Thank you for asking this question, but also because now I can read a little more of some remarks I had prepared, but then decided maybe I would hold back on. So the thing that I grappled with a lot when I was writing this book, and it's in the preface, I mean, I talk about this, the preface is a very personal preface in many ways, but the hardest thing for me of this book, I mean, there were a lot of technical things that were hard about this book, but the hardest thing was the larger inevitable conclusion to which my book points, and I think which is the reason why people who could give 2 hoots about late antiquity might still be interested in it. And that is the eventual dominance of what is sometimes called Nicene or Nicene/Chalcedonian Christianity, that is what we sort of think of as the Orthodox Catholic Church, came at a tremendous cost to everybody who who didn't subscribe to it, to the practitioners of other ancient Mediterranean religions, to Christians who had different views of what it meant to be a Christian, and of course to Jews and Samaritans. And that dominance carried within it, and I think this is why it matters, the seeds of the continuing costs to all of those who would continue to resist it. So this book, on the one hand, this book stops at the beginning of the 7th century, because by then I already felt that I was so far out of my league, I just needed to say, no, I don't know anymore. I mean, I already am not sure what I know, but now I know I don't know anything, right? But in the preface, I write that I tried to resist a kind of teleological historical narrative in which the history that I consider here leads inexorably to ultimately the Holocaust. But even before the Holocaust, to all the absolutely horrific things that Christians do to Jews, and they also do to each other, starting already in this period, but in many ways ramping up. And you see this already in the beginnings of the Visigothic stuff, which I've actually been looking at a little bit more. But all kinds of horrific things happen. And in many ways, we see the beginnings of them here. And on the one hand, I tried not to say that this was inevitable, that it had to go the way it went. Right? Because I don't know that that's true, but there's no way to know whether that's true, right? It's a kind of useless exercise. It might have gone differently, but it didn't. But I think what this book does is it makes clearer the extent to which the spread of Christianity throughout the late antique Mediterranean was not benign for much of the ancient Mediterranean populace, right? And I think, and this is true, it was not benign for Jews. But I also think it's important for Jews to understand that it wasn't benign for a lot of other people as well. That although it was deeply, I mean, this book, on the one hand, the subtitle, with which I had to wrestle with my editor and the publisher a little, mostly because I wanted to call the book "What Christianity Cost the Jews," right? And then have it be the Mediterranean Diaspora in Late Antiquity. And then I thought, no, that's not a good idea. But this book is, although it is about what Christianity cost the Jews, it is also about what Christianity cost a lot of other people who were not Jews. And I think that is important to understand, that what happened to Jews was aimed at Jews, but it wasn't only aimed at Jews. And I don't think I fully thought about that until then. So that, I mean, I do think that that's in some ways why this is important, because it puts the beginnings of these processes into a different historical perspective. But it also makes us think about, I think, more again about how to evaluate these things. And in some ways, I would really love for this book to have a wider non-Jewish audience, but I don't know that that will happen, right? Because in many ways, I think it's good for Jewish readers to learn more about the history of Jews. I mean, there's another piece to this that we aren't really talking about, which is the extent to which I think it's good for Jews to know how diverse the history of Jews is. But even beyond that, I think there's a kind of an important statement here that people need to be aware of how complex their own history is, and that the history that is told of Christianity is a history that is deeply, angled in one particular direction. I don't know if that's exactly the answer that you were looking for, but
I don't have a particular answer. I just know that when I first started dealing with Christian destruction of Mithraea and other religious sites, and then synagogues, the bibliography was so utterly thin.
Yeah.
That there was just no one to talk to and nothing to read, because it was so latently supersessionist, even when it called itself Late Antiquity.
Yes. No, I think that's.
And when I first started saying it, they thought I was crazy.
Yeah. No, and you and I have
too.
this, right. You and I have had this conversation. This became a lot clearer to me. And it's still a bit of a resistance. There's an alternative narrative out there, and some of you who are listening may or may not be aware of this, but I alluded to it briefly in the beginning, that lots of scholars have, and I think rightly, focused on a kind of critique of so the traditional Christian narrative basically says along comes Christianity and Jews and Judaism just, they just deteriorate rapidly. And the whole thing goes to maybe not quite hell in a handbasket, but that Judaism becomes moribund and nobody wants to be a Jew, and the life of Jews is awful and terrible, and that's it. And there's been a lot of scholarly pushback against that have sort of said, no, that's not what happens, and Jews go on leading perfectly fine economic and social lives, and they're flourishing and thriving, and their businesses are going well, and they're building beautiful synagogues, and really that's a lot of rhetoric, but it's not what people's lives on the ground are like. And there is some truth to that, right? There is certainly some truth to that, that's not an accurate account either of what happens. But that account itself then tries, I think, not to look at the extent to which there is violence directed at Jews. There are all kinds of legal pressures put on Jews. Christian bishops are preaching really nasty sermons about Jews, and how many people took them seriously, how much of an effect it had on how people dealt with their neighbors, we don't really know. But I think we know from our own modern lives that rhetoric matters, that when you hear horrible things said about people in the public media that are available, whatever they are, it begins to affect the ways in which you think about people and you deal with them. And I think that was one of the things that I was trying to get at in this book.
And that's so important. Sure we have time for more questions.
Yeah, let's take some questions. Yes.
Okay, Mr. Weiss, you had a question?
Can I be heard?
Yes, we can hear you. I can.
Yes,
sorry. First, we had Mr. Weiss here, Tom Weiss.
Is he still
Thank you. Really enjoyed your speech, and I have several questions, but let me just, I'll try to ask just one. You indicated that the level of learning, scholarship, and understanding of the Jews at this time, especially of Hebrew and rabbinic literature, was rather low, or was questionable. My question is, how then all of a sudden in the 7th, 8th, 9th, or 10th centuries, all of a sudden they blossomed with all those people?
So, that is the question, right? That is exactly the question. And so let me say two pieces of this. That is a really good question. I don't know the answer to that, how that happens. And my sense of this also is that that a lot of other scholars wish they knew the answer to this as well. This is a very murky history that is very difficult to write, right? And all I can tell you is that in the materials that I work on, right, there is on the one hand, we know there are rabbis, and we know there is a developing, let's call it a rabbinic culture, but we don't really have much in the way of useful evidence for how far the rabbis themselves and their ideas and their cultural productions are traveling, and how much other people, other Jews far away from them, are aware of this, right? And to the extent that we have evidence about Jews around the Mediterranean, there is virtually nothing to help us to write that history, and a great deal that poses challenges to that, right? So, for example, there's a very famous little article by Shia Cohen, I don't know if you're aware of it, who was at JTS for many years and then was my colleague at Brown and just recently retired from Harvard, and who wrote an article on epigraphic rabbis, in which he pointed out that in this entire epigraphic corpus for Jews in the ancient Mediterranean, there are a tiny number of men who are called rabbi, tiny, tiny, tiny. And it's not clear that any of them are what we might mean when we talked about an ancient rabbi, right? That this might be a title that means teacher or something else, right? And so one of his points was, what does this mean, right? Because you would think if there was a kind of normative rabbinic culture in this part of the world at this time, we would see evidence for it. And we really don't. So I wish I could answer your question because I would like to know the answer, right?
A quick follow-up.
Sure.
I understand, and there is many countries, Hungary being one, was where there isn't any, for a long time there was a desert or a lack of rabbinic, but in the rest of the place, it's logical. You have to prove why there wasn't, because at the end, afterwards, it came out that there were, okay? So it might not have been a majority, or but there was an influential movement.
Right. So this is a conversation that Steve and I have had a little bit, and I think we may have more. But let me see if I can just give you a different answer to it. Now we're to the what's the standard here? Do I have to prove I'm innocent, or do I have to prove you can prove I'm guilty? Do I have to prove I'm innocent? My general method as a historian is to make as few assumptions as possible and to go with the evidence that I have. And not to impose on my evidence my assumptions ahead of time about what I should find. I mean, this is my general way of functioning as a historian. And what I argue in the book, right, is that, and this, I alluded to this a little bit at the end, that in the end of this period that I'm working in, so sort of in the 5th and 6th centuries, you begin to find in Jewish inscriptions in Italy in particular, which is where we now have a lot of the evidence, you do begin to find an increased use of Hebrew. And you find there's one burial inscription, it's actually a very sad burial inscription for a 14-year-old young woman who comes from an elite family in a town in Italy, whose burial inscription says that at her funeral, 2 rebites and 2 apostoloi sang the funeral dirges for her. Now, the problem is, what do these phrases mean? And also, of all the burial inscriptions in this town, for which we have a lot, actually, we have a whole catacomb of these things, she's the only one where it says this, right? And this is the only mention of somebody who gets these 2 figures, these 4 people, singing her funeral dirges. I think that there may be a hint here that there is beginning to be movement. This would be one way to think of it. But now in the 6th century, there is beginning to be the movement of either individual traveling rabbis or maybe groups of rabbis who are working their way west and who are beginning to offer to Jews that they find in diaspora communities their ways of thinking, their traditions, and that eventually this becomes persuasive. And that Jews who come into contact with rabbinic ideas find them valuable. And I think that's a helpful way to begin to think about it, rather than to assume that they're always there, but you can't see it, right? And there's one other issue here that I would point out. It's the linguistic issue, right? Which is, there is virtually no evidence that Jews in the diaspora have any meaningful competence in either Hebrew or Aramaic. And although there is some evidence that rabbis have some competence in Greek, but it doesn't work the other way around. So if you want to take the position that there is a rabbinic culture there that we just can't see, then you also have to deal with the question of, are rabbinic materials being translated into Greek and into Latin? And if so, why can't we see them? And if not, then how exactly is that going to work? So this is a long conversation, and it's a discussion that goes on in the field a lot. You know, you're not the first person to raise these questions.
Oh, I know.
So
thank you. And I wish I had more time. Thank you.
But let's go on. Thank you.
So here's the challenge. Our hour is up, but we have 6 questions that I know of. You tell me what you think. I can stay. So anybody's invited to stay. If you can't stay, I'm happy to follow up with you afterwards. Gregory, you had a question? Mr. Katz, you had a question? You had raised your hand before.
I can't be heard.
No. Mr. Katz, he's on mute still?
No question.
Okay, your hand was up before. So Roni, you had a question?
Yes. First of all, thank you very much. You have shed an amazing light on a period which is not very well known, and it also raises in my mind a number of questions. relate to the practice of Judaism in that period. However, my question is another one. In two of the mosaics that you showed, the two from Tunisia, I noticed there was a depiction of fish.
Yes.
Now we know that fish is a symbol, has become a symbol of Christianity. Now, how do you explain the depiction of fish in those mosaics, if they were the floor of a synagogue?
Yeah, I don't think it's I think, I'm sorry, there's a joke going through my head that I'm not going to tell because it's a little inappropriate. But I think the answer is that fish is a multifaceted symbol. I mean, one might, for example, think of the fish that swallows Jonah. So I think that although some Christians use the symbol of the fish, for some of you who may not know this, it is because, in part at least, the phrase Jesus Christ, Son of God, is in Greek, basically the letters spell out the Greek word for fish, ichthus, but I don't think that means that every fish is a symbol of Christ. Right. I think it means that the symbol works in certain circles, but you see depictions of fish in lots of mosaics, and they're not all symbols of Christians. So in and of itself, I don't think this means anything. And that Latin inscription very clearly identifies the site as a synagogue. So,
But it was interesting to find it in Tunisia, which is the Western Mediterranean. However, the mosaics that you showed on the Eastern Mediterranean, Greece, Italy, or Turkey, did not represent a fish, but always repeated the same symbols: the etrog, the shofar, and the menorah.
So here's the other thing you should keep in mind: two things. One is I didn't show you comprehensive mosaics from these sites. I deliberately chose to show you certain pieces. And the other thing is we do not have remotely a comprehensive catalog, right? We have a relatively small number of sites that have been found by accident. And if you compare this to the mosaics from the land of Israel, you will see some amazing things on these mosaics. So I wouldn't worry too much about this one particular thing. I think you have to look at the totality of the evidence and always remember that we don't have the totality of the evidence. So it's a kind of caution.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Eric, you had a question?
Well, thank you very much for the lecture and for the information provided, and it really makes me want to read the book. I've written it down, it's on my list. I put a question on the board, but that's kind of a generic question, and if it's okay, I want to change direction and ask something else. You touched on something that to me might be very profound and go towards the history of anti-Semitism. You talked about at that period, Christianity was intolerant, not just of Jews, but other minorities. But it occurs to me those minorities disappeared from the historical map. And the one group that survived were Jews. So is it possible to trace like a lineage of the intolerance, Christian intolerance against many minorities, but the only one that survived was Jews, and that led to the later institutionalization of anti-Semitism because that was the one minority that
couldn't do in?
That they couldn't eliminate.
Yeah, well, okay, so let me say a couple of quick things. First of all, there's another group that they don't eliminate, although we don't talk about it a lot, and that's the Samaritans. There are still Samaritans. There aren't lots and lots of them, but there are still Samaritans. And actually, that's a whole other interesting question, the relationship of sort of Christians to Samaritans. The other point I want to make is that the groups they were going after were not at that point minorities. When Constantine becomes the Roman emperor in the beginning of the 4th century, it's been estimated, although again, our ability to do demographics is terrible. We don't have census records. But the estimates of scholars are that the population of the Roman Empire was maybe 10% Christian at the beginning of the 4th century. And that there might have been a comparable number of Jews as well. Again, don't believe too much of what you read about this because nobody really knows. But the order of magnitude might be right, that approximately a tenth of the empire was Christian. So when Christian emperors start going after everybody else, right? They're not going after minorities, they're going after the majority, right? It's a whole different dynamic. I mean, it's a really interesting thing to think about, right? I think it's an interesting question of whether Christians continue to go after Jews because they survive, but I think it's more complicated because Christian conflicts between Christians themselves, different churches, right, never go away, right? Ireland in the 20th century, right? I mean, this stuff never goes away. They continue to fight with one another through different groups. So I don't think it's that simple, right? I think there are larger questions here about the ways in which groups of humans deal with other groups of humans. But I think that Christians continue to have particular, how do I say this, antagonisms towards Jews that I'm not even sure it's possible to easily explain. And I think we want to always come up with the explanation for why Christian churches are so vehemently hostile to Jews. And I don't know that there's a simple answer to this. So I appreciate your observation, but I think there's not one simple, there's not one simple answer to this.
Ms. Goldberg? You need to unmute yourself.
There was the Roman Empire extended to Morocco as well. And
Yes,
I'm just wondering if there have been any Jewish sites found in Morocco that.
I have to think about this. I don't believe that to date we have any synagogues sites that come from Morocco. The interesting thing about North Africa, or what was Roman North Africa in general, but basically Tunisia, Morocco, maybe Libya, and even Egypt to some extent, is one of the least well researched sort of areas of evidence for Jews. And I think there are a lot of sort of modern explanations for this. A lot of it has to do with where the excavations get done and who does the excavating. But off the top of my head, I want to say no, that we have not yet found any synagogue sites in Morocco. I think the only ones that I'm aware of are in Tunisia. But there are other kinds of material evidence for Jews, and I think, but I want to be careful about this, I think that there is some epigraphic evidence from Morocco, but I want to be careful about that. That might not entirely be right. If you want to email me for a more definitive answer, my Brown email is on the Brown University website. It's just ross_kraemer@brown.edu. And I could go take a look and give you a slightly better answer. So please feel free to do that.
Okay. David, you had a question?
Yes. Late fourth century, early 5th century Antioch. We have the evidence of St. John I can never pronounce it, Chrysostom.
Chrysostom, it doesn't matter. Chrysostom, people say both, right?
But from which it is apparent that there was a very severe challenge to Christianity from a flourishing Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
How do you explain that in the light of what you've been saying?
Well, so I think the answer is, it's complicated there too. I think, first of all, Antioch, I mean, different places were different, right? I think this is an important thing to keep in mind. Antioch is not Alexandria, is not Rome, is not, North Africa, right? And I think the dynamics of Antioch are probably something that you have to look at specifically. But look, even in Antioch, and again, for those of you who are listening to this, right? So John Chrysostom is a late 4th century Christian writer, priest, who writes some very famous sermons that are called, they're literally called Against the Jews. There are scholars who want to argue that they're not against Jews, they're really just against Christians who are interested in Jewish practices. I actually have changed my mind about that. I think that calling them against Jews is pretty much what he means. But they are about the extent to which Christians in Antioch in the late 4th century are interested in engaging in Jewish practices, going to synagogues for the high holidays in the fall. And that's when these sermons are written. I don't see those at all as a contradiction to the arguments that I'm making here, right? In other words, I'm actually not trying to argue for this model that, you know, everything is terrible for the Jews. What I'm trying to argue is that things are complex. And that was my point a little bit about saying that, you know, Christians are clearly engaged in violence against Jews, but there are some instances in which I think it's highly likely that Jews were engaged in violence against Christians. And particularly where they had the power to do so. And Antioch may very well have been one of those places where, by virtue of the size of Jewish communities and their patronage connections and their relationships to the power elites, that they had the ability to engage in these kind of contestations that weren't necessarily true in other places. And so in many ways, I think each of these situations is local, but the totality of it over the period that I'm looking at has a kind of trajectory to it. And I think that's my larger point.
Would you say it was a linguistic thing that possibly Christians may have been attracted to Judaism because they were Aramaic speaking and that they understood what was going on in a synagogue? We don't really know
Antioch?
whether. Yeah,
in Antioch?
Well, there must have been. Obviously, the majority would have been Greek speaking, but there were certainly Aramaeans who presumably would have been Aramaic speaking.
Yeah, but my short answer to your question is no, I don't think it's linguistic. I think whatever interest, and remember, Chrysostom is writing in Greek. I think whatever is going on isn't dependent on linguistics, at least not in that case. No.
It's going on in Greek.
Well, but even if it's not going on in Greek, I think whatever it is that's of interest to people is not dependent here on the language in which they're experiencing this, right? But thank you for your question. George,
thank you all. I don't want to go too far over, so I want to make sure that we keep to the time. I have to tell you, I learned quite a bit, so I appreciate it very much. And I look forward to continue reading the book, so thank you. And I hope that you all will continue reading the book, and I will send a follow-up email tomorrow. So, and if you, with your email, with your permission, as you.
Absolutely, you may send my brown email around if people have questions. Can I say one more quick thing?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, this book is expensive. I wish it were less expensive, and I hope that Oxford will soon bring out a paperback, but they're not going to do it anytime immediately. They will, I think, eventually. But what I was just going to say to you is, you know, if you have a very large book budget and you would like to buy this book, I won't tell you not to. It is a little less expensive electronically. But the other thing I was going to say is, see if you can get your local library or your local synagogue library or any other public library to buy a copy. And that way you can read it and other people can read it, or at least share a copy. Buy it in a group, because there was nothing I could do about this. It makes me very unhappy, but it's the reality of book publishing. And if you have access to a university library, you can read the book online for free, because university libraries buy the rights to this. So if you have some way of accessing university websites, then that's a good way too.
You're not a capitalist.
Not that kind, no. The academics don't go into this for the money, believe me.
Well, have a good day, evening, night, wherever you are in the world. Thank you all. We hope to see you again after Passover, after Pesach.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you. Bye. Bye, George. Thank you.
Thank you.